Hello again, and welcome back. Um, normally, I'll do videos, at least mostly inspired by my adventures in book hunting, hence the name of the channel. Um, this week, I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to talk about things that lead people to book hunt in the first place. And in my case, it was the development of a real love of reading very early in life as an elementary school student. And I don't remember exactly where it started, but as an elementary school student, third, fourth, fifth grade in that range, I remember starting to read, age-appropriate books. I was reading Hardy Boys and Tom Swift and that kind of thing. And from there, I started to branch out and to some other things. Really developed a love for Greek and Roman mythology. So I was reading children's versions of Homer and Virgil and Wolfentz's mythology, yeah, those sorts of things. And I remember at that age and thereafter, uh, starting to request books as Christmas presents. We used to get this thing called the Sears catalog, and there was always a section in it, um, in the Christmas catalog, where they sold books. They sold classic versions, children's versions of classic literature. I got a set of those one Christmas. I got Jules Verne. I got H.G. Wells. Just a multitude of things to fuel my reading interests. And while my parents weren't really big readers, uh, and I was the oldest of four siblings, so I was kind of ahead of everybody else in reading outside of school. But I did have some other family reading influences. Um, my father's parents were both avid readers. My grandfather, on that side especially, um, gave me a lot, wound up giving me a lot of interesting books. From him, I discovered, he loved Zane Grey, so I got to read Zane Grey. He liked Frederick Forsyth and other what I call men's adventure thrillers. Read a lot of that. He was a World War II veteran. He really enjoyed books about the Second World War. Um, and in fact, as a teenager, I remember well, um, my parents decided they wanted to start getting him books, once again, like as Christmas presents. And they would always get me to pick the stuff out. And I did a good job, I think. He always seemed very happy with the choices I made. In part because, I knew what he liked, and secondly, because I knew what he'd already read. Um, and on my mother's side, I had two aunts who were avid readers. They read a lot of romance, a lot of historical fiction, which actually I didn't read a lot of romance, but really enjoyed a lot of the historical fiction that they read and recommended to me. I think started reading John Jakes because of one of my aunts. Um, and my there was one of my aunts who really enjoyed science fiction, um, especially like Star Trek stories, novelizations, early on, back before pocketbooks went crazy with the idea. Um, and they both enjoyed Western fiction, particularly Louis L'Amour. I got my introduction to Louis L'Amour through them, reading the Sackett books and some of his other popular titles. And then there was their mother, my mother's mom, my maternal grandmother. And obviously, this video is about her and a couple of recommendations she made to me. In fact, she gave me both of the books I'm about to show you. And I don't have those editions that I got from her 40 years ago, but I did read both of the books she gave me and kept them for a while. And who knows? They're lost to time. I don't know what happened to either of those original volumes that she gave me, but as I've had opportunity, I've collected them back again, and I'm going to show them to you what the editions I have now as I'm talking about those books. Um, as I said, my grandmother Butler, realizing that I had this burgeoning interest in reading, decided to help fuel it somewhat. And so she gave me two books. And the first one I want to talk about is The Virginian by Owen Wister. Um, the original copy I got from her was also a hardback, but as I said, it's lost to the sands of time. But to replace it, I got this very nice Reader's Digest edition. Oh, there we go. The Virginian, Owen Wister. And I do really love Reader's Digest editions. It's too bad they don't make them anymore. And I'm lucky enough to have one with the insert, with biographical information and information about the book. And let me see, and as all Reader's Digest editions are, there are illustrations. Let me see if I can find a few of those. Okay, like you'll have little spot illustrations like this throughout. And I know, yes, yes. And then, full 2-page illustrations, to go along with the story. I should probably say now, there are bound to be spoilers when I talk about these books. Um, and another caveat, um, the information I tell you about this book and the next one are based on me reading these books 40 years ago. I read these as basically a middle school kid. And so, please take my summaries with a bit of a grain of salt. Because you know how it goes. Mostly what I have now left from these books is impressions more than a lot of detail. When I decided to talk about both of these books for this video today, I kicked it around in my head, and um, this one made a slightly less impact, and I'll explain why. I remembered more details from the next book, which is The Good Earth by Pearl Buck, than this one. But I think part of the reason for this was a lighter read. It was, this is a Western. In fact, some would say this is the first Western. And people who came after Owen Wister, um, they owe him, I guess, a tip of the hat at least, um, because he kind of got there first. He formulated a lot of the tropes that you'll see in Western fiction to this day. Stories about how gunfights work, about stoic men with strict codes of honor being thrown into situations with people with no honor, evil men, desperados, and how they interact with them based upon their very strict personal codes of conduct. Serious men, a few words. In fact, the trope of the man with no name, well, if you've ever seen a Clint Eastwood spaghetti western, or any of his westerns after that, like Pale Rider or High Plains Drifter, the protagonist is a figure. He's in a lot of ways not a real person. In the Virginian is never called by his real name. He is known as the Virginian. As I recall, there were a couple other nicknames they gave the guy, but his real name is never used, even though the book is told from his point of view. Whether it's getting into gunfights or herding cattle or being part of a posse. There's a storyline, as I recall, where he makes close friendship with another cowboy and is forced to partake in his hanging after he's convicted of cattle rustling. But he does it because, once again, he's living by a strict code of honor, and his personal preferences are pushed to the side on it. Um, the, you get classic lines, as I recall, that when I read other westerns later on, it made me remember these things, the things I read in this. The title character, the Virginian himself, is an individual who is from Virginia, and in the post Civil War years, he's leaving Virginia, seeking a new life. He's part of what I've described as the Confederate diaspora. He is a Confederate soldier who's lost it all, and so he's going someplace else to try and rebuild both his fortune and his life. And you'll find in Western fiction and in Western movies, that's a very common trope. um, the ex-Confederate, and usually the ex-Confederate's a good guy. And he's part of that stereotype man of honor who's lost everything, but is trained for violence, is fully capable of violence. Um, and also, typically, the character trope is a Southerner who is fairly well educated. Um, while even though an educated man, he's still a man of few words, and Virginian is somewhat like that. Um, my grandmother gave some, as I recall while reading the book, some pretty accurate descriptions of what was in the book as far as plot points and what the Virginian was like. And eventually, the Virginian, he finds a nice, stable life again. He works for an honorable man and on a cattle ranch, I believe, in Montana. It's again, 40 years of impressions. But he marries the school marm, which is also kind of a Western trope. Um, but this is called the first Western, even though there were probably thousands of Westerns written before that, dime novels, shoot 'em ups, those kind of things. But this is thought of as the first Western with real literary quality. And Owen Wister was a well-educated man from Philadelphia, went west late in the 19th century to kind of reading between the lines to find a cure for his melancholy, for his depression, to take the cure, as they would say in those days. He was a friend and compatriot of Theodore Roosevelt, who did the same thing in the 18th century. He was, a man from New York who, moved west to try and find himself. And while uh, while Theodore Roosevelt also wrote extensively about the West, most of what Roosevelt wrote were stories of his adventures, of the hunts, the camping trips, the expeditions, um, and those, of course, were very good too. But um, this is a book about an age that at the time was dying. The cowboy culture was fading away. The Old West was fading away. And this is a book that sees it with nostalgia and a lot of romanticism. Um, my grandmother was also a big fan of the TV show that was adapted from this novel. And um, uh, like I say, she I think really did enjoy this one. And like I say, the way she talked about it, I felt like she had actually read it and had actually enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it too. Um, Once again, I think a lot of the details have left me in part because it is a lot like other westerns, and I've read quite a few westerns since then. Not any very the very recent past, but in my teenage years, college years, I read quite a few, and and like I say, because I think the story was familiar, that I've lost some details. Uh, it's my thought anyway. Now, the second book I read, I have my doubts as to whether or not my grandmother actually read it. Um, she gave me a very detailed description of the Virginian. The next book she gave to me was The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. This book was published, I believe, in 1931. It won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932. It was a best-selling novel for both of those years, as I recall. Pearl Buck won a Nobel Prize in 1938, and I think predominantly, or at least in large part, because of this book. And as I understand it, there were two sequels. Um, but Pearl Buck was born in West Virginia uh, to missionaries. She lived a very short time in West Virginia and lived most of her life in China, working with her parents as missionaries. And so she became intimately familiar with Chinese culture. And I know from reading about her life that when she came back to America as an adult, having lived away in China for many years, that she almost felt like a foreigner in her own country. Oh, and just as an aside, as I indicated, she got a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938, and is one of only two West Virginians to win a Nobel Prize at all, the other being Bluefield, West Virginia's own John Nash, who won it for economics, called the year. But if you ever get to Bluefield, West Virginia, as you're coming in, you'll see the little green sign that says this is his birthplace. But anyway, back to Ms. Buck. Um, she writes a very stark and realistic and gritty novel about the life of a Chinese peasant farmer named Wang Lang or Wang Lang. Um, Starts on his wedding day and extols his life as a peasant farmer, the hard work, and the book lets you know very quickly that Wang Lang is a very hardworking man, at first a very honest man, a very honorable man, a very simple man. Um, and as I said, goes through his trials and tribulations. It starts on his wedding day. He marries a young woman, Olan. Um, Olan is um, neither pretty nor educated, um, but they build a life together. And Olan has a lot of the same qualities that he does. She also is frugal, hardworking, um, very independent. There's descriptions early on of their lives together, the intimacies of marriage, um, about them having children. They have, I think, two sons at first, um, and the descriptions of that were kind of startling to my 12-year-old self. Oh yeah, did I mention I was 12 years old? This will be important. I was 12 years old when she gave me both of these books. Once again, the Western, the Virginian, made some sense. I mean, there's violence there, but it wasn't graphic. Um, Nothing that you'd worry about with a 12-year-old. But let's continue on this one. Olan gives birth to all of their children on her own. She delivers her own babies by herself without any assistance. It's a very tough woman. I remember a scene in this novel where they're working together in the rice paddy. When the birth pains come upon her, and she goes back to the hut, delivers the child, and then as soon as she delivers the child, she comes back and starts working in the rice fields again. Olan is one tough lady, which was kind of startling to 12-year-old me. That whole scene and that whole process. As they grow their family, tragedy strikes in the form of a severe drought, where they lose about everything and have to make some very tough choices. A distant relative offers them money for their farm, but is trying to take advantage of the fact that they're desperate now, to really lowball them on the price. Wang refuses to do that, and instead they sell all of their personal items, all their equipment, their livestock they have left, and they move briefly to a large city. And basically start out as beggars. They've really hit rock bottom at this point. Um, Wang gets a job as a rickshaw driver for a while. And there are some funny scenes. Funny scenes are few and far between in this book. It's a very serious book, but I was always amused. I remember being amused by the scenes where he's interacting with Europeans for the first time in this large city, and the descriptions of Europeans in this book are funny because they're described almost as if they're aliens, and I mean extraterrestrial aliens, like they're a different species. The way they act, the way they present themselves is so different than what Wang is used to. That is startling to them, and that cultural dissonance is funny. Um, it looks like he and his family are going to live out lives of very quiet desperation until a food riot breaks out. Food has gotten, famine has reached the city, and things get so desperate that the people there um, start to riot, and they go through the part of town where the rich merchants live, and Wang and Olan get caught up in it. Um, I don't remember all the details, but I remember there's a point where the owner of the house gives Wang considerable amount of money to leave him alone, basically to buy him off, to thinking that he's there to do him harm. And really, Wang is just a victim of circumstance. He just got caught up in a mob and got rushed into this guy's house. Olan, on the other hand, found some jewels that were stashed in the house and took them for her own. But in any event, with this newfound wealth, they decide to go back home to the farm that they still own, and they buy new livestock and new equipment, and they start over, and they prosper based on this ill-gotten gain. Um, I don't remember how Wang justified it in his mind. I know that there were scenes when they were living in the city where he was ashamed of begging, and where at some point maybe Olan had stolen some food and he refused it, in fact threw it away. And I know there's a scene where she like took some meat that she'd stolen, he threw on the ground. She cleaned it off and cooked it for the kids, you know. Olan was always very pragmatic, as I recall. But in any event, but then things turn for them. They start to prosper. He becomes one of the wealthiest people in the village because they do so well. He starts frequenting tea houses, which, as I recall from the book, were more like brothels than a place just to go drink tea. And he winds up eventually buying a concubine, a mistress from the madam there. So I recall her name was, I think, Lotus. And it turns out Lotus has a pretty good opium habit, which, since he is now Metamines, he supplies in part to have her and to, take her back to his house. He builds a much finer house to keep her in. I know there's a scene at some point in the novel where he takes some of the jewelry that Olan had taken, some pearls, and has them made into earrings for his new mistress, who's living there in the house with him. Um, I'd had my problems with Wang up to that point, but they continue to grow throughout the novel, and that one I really remember thinking, ugh, I don't like this guy. um, uh, there, and I forgot to mention this. At the beginning of the book, Wang lives alone with his father, and his father seems to be disabled in some way. And there were some things that were kind of creepy about his father. Um, his father's thrilled to know that they're having children, and he's hoping that they're boys because he wants someone to sleep with, ostensibly for body heat, for warmth, during the cold. But even my 12-year-old mind thought, this is kind of creepy. This is very odd. Um, but in any event, it seems like the more prosperous the family gets, the worse troubles they have. Because they give in to decadence and excessive spending and exhibiting that wealth and that luxury. Wang sends his two oldest sons off to be educated, something that he never had. He keeps this third son back on the farm to run the farm, and basically alienates himself from that son because he expects the son to do all the work on the farm while he lives a life of indolence. And in the end, once again, my recollection, the youngest son, who he'd forced to stay on the farm, runs off to join the army. And later in life, he hears his two other sons arguing about how they're going to split the money when their father's dead and they sell the farm and, go off to the city. So, like I say, he alienates himself from his entire family. Olan dies. And I think after Olan dies, as I recall, and once again, these are 40-year-old memories, but it seems to me like he took a new mistress who was extraordinarily young. We're talking in modern day, criminally young, to be his new mistress. And by the time I got to the end of this book, um, enough drug use, sexual, well, particularly for my 12-year-old mind, then sexual immorality, prostitution, um, just a lot of excess, and just a complete upending of the way this guy started. Um, he has his highs and lows, but once again, it seems like the better off this guy is, the worst decisions he makes. But I got to the end, and I started kicking around my head, and ever since then, I can only conclude my grandmother either had not actually read the book, or had only read a little bit of the book, or had forgotten what was in the book, because this is not the kind of book that my grandmother would have given a 12-year-old. My grandmother was very conservative socially in every other way. Um, was part of the same very fundamentalist evangelical church that I grew up in. She was there the whole time. Like I said, I just can't imagine. There's no way I can imagine this woman giving any 12-year-old, particularly me, this book. Now, once again, both of these books that she gave me, um, Grandma Butler's reading recommendations, they were both great books. They were both great books. I'm glad I read both. And like I said, I think The Good Earth sticks with me more detail-wise because it was so different, and I think so startling when I was reading it as a 12-year-old that it stuck with me more. Once again, I'm relying on 40-year-old memories, so um, I would suggest if you want to read these books and you want to learn more about, uh, there's going to be plenty of reviews of both of these books online and on YouTube. Go take a look to see if it's still something you want to read. I would recommend it to anyone right now. Um, but those were part of those early books, and they were books that made me spread my wings. Um, I would have never read The Good Earth I don't think, by just picking it out, off of a shelf and reading it at random. If I'd been assigned it in school, I would have read it, but that would have been it. But after reading it, I think Owen Wister needs more credit than he's ever gotten for his book, because he did. He blazed a trail for an entire genre. And Pearl Buck, in her lifetime and since then, has gotten many accolades, and is a very good writer and a very honest writer. I think she doesn't glamorize her characters. She shows you the world as it is, which is a good quality, I think. But in any event, enjoyed both, in spite of whether or not my grandmother actually read both. I'm glad she gave me both. Um, and so, like I said, this has been more of an adventures in reading than an adventures in book hunting. But I highly recommend, just to sign off, highly recommend both of these. I would like to get The Good Earth in a better copy. I'm very happy with my copy of Virginian. Um, I'd love to get this in a different classic line. The one I have is, what is it? I think Washington Square Press Classics. I know there's an Everyman Library edition. There is a Modern Library edition, which I'd like to get. There was a Reader's Digest edition, but Reader's Digest is no more. So, well, at least their classic line is no more. Would love to have that one. To my knowledge, Penguin doesn't do it in their classic line, nor Signet. But I'm on the lookout for, like, say, a more permanent resident for my library bookshelves. And who knows? This book is actually still under copyright. It should not come into the public domain until, if I'm not mistaken, probably January 1st, 2026. My hope is that somebody will pick it up again and reprint it in one of the big classic reprint houses. We'll do it again. But yeah, at this point, I would love to have a modern library version from back in the 40s. But with that, I will say goodbye, and hopefully next time there'll be something to report from the hunting grounds. But if not, then more discussions of why I'm hunting books in the first place. In any event, thank you, and see you again soon.